So this week we are talking about lesson 5, which is all about drawing animals. As usual, if you're looking at this video or trying out this lesson, I'm expecting that you've completed lessons 1 and 2, as well as 3 and 4. And this is largely because lessons 1 and 2 kind of teach you the building blocks that we're going to be playing with, all the tools that we're going to be using, like different kinds of forms, organic forms, and so on. And lessons 3 and 4 start in the process of teaching you what constructive drawing is. So if you haven't completed those, definitely go back and do them before you continue watching this video. So I've got quite a few things that I want to touch upon because over the past couple of years, people have really struggled with certain elements that are applied to using construction when drawing animals. And so I'll try and clarify each of those points individually. The first thing that we need to go over is the basic structure of an animal's body. And it's basically the same as a human's body, not that I expect you to have touched upon that subject yet, but they are composed of 3 different components. And actually this is somewhat similar to the insects as well, which had their head, thorax, and abdomen. But here we have actually a cranium. And note that I'm using that terminology. The cranium is supposed to be the back part of the skull, I believe. So it's not the whole head. Keep that in mind. Then you have the rib cage, and you have the pelvis. And notice that while the cranium is more or less a spherical ball, the rib cage and the pelvis are both deformed in order to fit the actual mass that they're representing. So oftentimes the rib cage will be considerably larger and the pelvis will be smaller. Additionally, take a look at the particular angles that I've drawn them at. You want to look at your reference image very closely to kind of inform the decisions that you're making as to the size, the angle, and so on when drawing these masses. Because unlike the cranium, all of this has to really, it's not just a circle. It's going to match exactly what you see there, or close enough to it anyways. At first it'll be a little bit tricky to, first of all, see where the rib cage might be, because you don't have x-ray vision. You can only see the outer layer of the animal that you're looking at. But with time, you'll start to notice little hints and suggestions along the surface that actually tell you roughly where the rib cage actually extends to. Additionally, it can be difficult to really nail these angles initially, but you'll get better at it with practice. And if you happen to make a little mistake here and there, just keep pushing forwards. Trust me, I do it all the time. I'm not perfect at this, and neither will you be. Not for a while. So the second component of this is that, actually no, first let's talk about how all of this is tied together with a spine, just like in your body. And the spine will often run, well, pretty much always will run closer towards the back. If this part here is the front, then their back will be where their spine is going to be situated, roughly. And remember that tails are just an extension of the spine, so keep that in mind. And so the part that I wanted to mention was that one of the earliest things that I do, sometimes I'll even do this before even drawing the head, the cranium mass, I connect this into a sausage. And you'll remember these from lesson 2. All of the organic forms with contour curves that I've forced you to draw. These come in very handy here, and notice the shape that I'm using. The specific dips and like how this here kind of pinches in and it comes out on this side, on the bottom. Always try and follow that shape. You'll notice that in most situations actually, you'll have a bigger bump in the back. Ignore it for now. Always draw your back so that this section is tucking in. That'll allow you to keep your widths nice and consistent, which will make your organic form much more solid, and you want a nice and solid base to be constructing everything off of. We will eventually add in more forms to deal with this sort of bump, but for now, just ignore it. Always follow this recipe. I always tell people to constantly stare at their reference, but try and imagine that there is an actual dip here, even underneath all the extra muscles and masses. So I guess the next thing to jump to is actually talking about those extra masses. Since this is the first basic form that you're going to be constructing from your other, ball masses, you will afterwards, you might want to look into adding more forms on top of this. And this is where the organic intersections from lesson 2 comes in, where you're wrapping forms around each other. So here I've got a separate mass that is sitting on top of our initial sausage. And you'll see that I've actually added some contour curves to just show how it has its own volume, and it's not just a flat shape that I'm adding to the two-dimensional drawing. This is an actual 3D form that we're piling on top. So you need to be aware of how it's going to wrap around and conform to the underlying form. And so anywhere you see on your reference image that you've got these additional bumps and masses and things, you really want to flesh them out as being solid forms. You can't just, say, okay, well, this guy has a little bump here, so I'm just going to add that. No, you have to actually flesh it out and understand how the forms are interacting with each other. So you'll actually find that oftentimes I'll just, in some of my demos, I'll throw them in wherever it seems that I need extra mass. So it's a very flexible tool that you can use. Next, let's talk about, so this is a bit of a combination, and it's all about how things intersect and connect to this basic fundamental form. So the first one that I usually tackle before I even talk about the legs, which is a major component that fits and connects onto the torso, I want to talk about the neck. So I will usually actually turn my sausage into a bit of a sort of flattened cap, so you could imagine that this was flat, because this helps me think about how the separate form of the neck is actually going to connect. And the neck is really just a sort of transitional form that leads from the cranium back to the torso, but I really want to be aware of how it connects these two and how they intersect. So these underlying ellipses that I've drawn are really important in understanding how everything comes together. So you can already see that this feels more three-dimensional. Like, you can't really tell what it is, but you can tell that there's a sort of body mass, that there's a neck. This doesn't really make much sense yet. And oftentimes I start off considering this thing to be the cranium, but then as I build it up, I might find that it's perhaps a little bit too small, or the way that it's related to the neck is not quite matching what the cranium would be. So in those situations, I'll just add I'll start treating it just as like the nub of the end of the neck, and I'll attach a sphere to it. Now this is our cranium. But we'll talk about that again in a bit. The next thing I want to talk about is the legs. So a lot of people, the first mistake that I start seeing is that they attach the legs to the bottom of their body. And this is not entirely correct. So let's say it's like that. Now, it could look okay, but the problem is that you're completely ignoring the shoulder muscles. There's a whole mass here. That actually pretty much makes it way more correct than it was before. So if you add them like this. So you can't just ignore this whole bulky mass that you might not entirely be able to see on your reference image that clearly because it's facing right towards you. So the shadows that usually describe that form are very easy to miss at times if you're not aware of the fact that they're there to begin with. So as a habit, even when I don't necessarily see the mass that clearly, I will always think about, okay, the legs need to connect to the torso, and they usually do right up here. So I'll always draw a ball, a sort of ellipse. You know, it's similar to the connection here, but it's got more actual mass to it. So you could actually describe the surface as being rounded like this, but it really depends on what you're drawing, on your reference image. So usually I just leave it as an ellipse. I don't draw additional contour curves on it, at least not just yet. So I do the same thing for the back. Now note that I'm actually not drawing this from a reference image. I'm just throwing forms onto the canvas and seeing what happens. So some of my decisions might not be super realistic, but I'm mostly working from memory, so they might be okay. So the second point about the legs that I want to mention is that I start breaking my own rules a little bit. Now, we've been working a lot in form over the past 2 lessons, the plants and the insects. And the thing is that it's important to always be aware of the fact that you're drawing forms, but what you actually put down onto the canvas may not always be fully three-dimensional. Now, the reason for this is that in certain cases, such as the legs, they tend to have a lot of flow to them and gesture to them. So I find that two-dimensional shapes will carry a sort of gesture much more easily than actually having to worry about, while you're actually constructing it. Oh dear, what did I just hit? Whoops. Anyway, what was I saying? So if you're trying to draw a 3D form that has gesture at the same time, it can get tricky. So because you're worrying about 2 different things at the same time, you're worrying about gesture and you're worrying about that form. So, I mean, if you're good at it, you might be able to manage something, but generally it's not a great idea to tackle multiple challenges simultaneously. So instead, what I end up doing is I just treat these as more 2D shapes while I'm drawing them. I know in my mind that they're 3-dimensional, that they have faces and different faces, that is, and that they've got volume to them, but right now I'm choosing to hold back on that in my drawing. I'm not sure if that's actually correct. Oh, that's right. Okay. So now the thing is that like I said, they're 2D shapes, but you can tell that because I'm still thinking of them as being 3D forms, I am making certain little subconscious choices, like having rounded caps here. You could just as well make them straight, but the more aware of your forms you are, the harder it is to kind of detach from them. But that's not a problem. That's actually a good thing, because you're not actually, it's not something you're consciously thinking about. As long as it's in your subconscious, it's not distracting you from what you're trying to do at this moment, which is capture the flow and gesture of this sort of back and forth zigzagging pattern that the legs have. Now, once you've got them on there, then you can start making the little refinements that actually show you that they've got form. So you might actually start adding a couple contour curves here and there. You might refine how these are connected. And always remember that these connection points are important. Don't draw, okay, that's a bad example. Don't draw like that. This bend here, actually mark out how it's, like where that point of bending or that pivot really is. It just helps you to better understand how everything is moving. In terms of actually rendering your forms, sometimes it really helps, and I've mentioned this in previous lessons, I'm sure, but it really helps to purposely flatten out the two limbs on the opposite side of your drawing, because it helps to push these forelimbs forwards, and it makes them much more, it kind of draws the attention of your viewer. Remember, whenever drawing any organic forms, you really should push yourself to maintain a fairly consistent, this is not going well, width to the form. Yeah, that's terrible. Now, you'll make mistakes, as I am clearly doing right now. Ultimately, what we're doing in these exercises and in the homework, it's not about drawing pretty drawings, it's about making all the mistakes that you need to learn your lessons. Because we all need to become very accustomed to the kinds of mistakes that we tend to make. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit too caught up in this. So the next point is all about head construction, which is something that a lot of people struggle with. Now, the biggest mistake people tend to make is that they'll deal with lots of nice form and construction with their body, and then they'll kind of just ignore the same concepts when dealing with the head. And there's really no reason to do that. Instead, what you want to do is you want to remember that this, being the cranium, is the sort of back part of the head, and everything is going to be extruded off of that. So the most common thing that you see in animals is that they've got a muzzle or a snout. And that is usually just a simple, well, a reasonably simple at least, box that comes off like this. And notice how this edge here, where the box is connecting to the ball, it's curving and wrapping around the ball. And this is important because it's just two forms that are intersecting with each other. And of course there's going to be more complexity to it, but you just keep building up more forms. And another important thing to be aware of is eye sockets. Before I draw the eyes, I'll always block in my eye sockets, because it really helps both to situate the eyeball inside of the skull and also deform that skull so that it can wrap around the eyeball, and so that other features like the brow ridge and so on will actually be modified in order to make everything feel like it fits together. anything that comes off the cranium, or off of any form really, should be wrapping around. I'm actually still not sure what I'm drawing. If it's well, it's starting to look more like a dog. That's a weirdly proportioned dog, but whatever. Yeah, this is all kinds of messed up. That's what happens when you don't work from reference. And you don't actually plan out what you're doing beforehand, I suppose. Anyway, so I will actually do another quick demonstration of how to construct a head in a little bit. But the next thing I want to talk about is fur. Oops, did not do that. Keep hitting the wrong button. Okay, fine, I'll just do this. Okay, so now when most people draw fur for the first time, they get completely overwhelmed by all the little bits of detail that's present in their reference image. And so they think of it as trying to draw every individual bit of fur. And eventually they start to realize that there is way too much fur to draw, and they lose their minds. Or they get really sloppy, as I've done here. And they start to zigzag and do all this garbage that you should absolutely avoid. The thing is that when you start to get really overwhelmed with whatever you're doing and you start to get sloppy, you start to rely more and more on randomness. And randomness is the devil. If you start to rely on randomness, then everything just looks chaotic, unplanned, poorly designed, and just really badly crafted. It's very obvious that there's no actual thought and intent that's gone into the drawing. And so that's always something you want to avoid. Even though something may look very, very chaotic, it almost never is. There's almost always a certain rhythm or pattern or flow to whatever's going on, just because of the way that physics works. If you think about hair, hair doesn't just go off in any and every direction. Clumps of hair form because hair tends to flow in the same direction. If you have a breeze going across a field of grass, all the grass, or at least a lot of the grass, is going to flow in the same direction as the wind. So there's no reason to ever rely on randomness. Now, this may require you to pay very careful attention to your reference image, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles. It's going to be difficult, it's going to be a pain in the ass, but you have to roll with it. Now, there are a few tricks that make drawing for a hell of a lot easier. And so I will show them to you right now. And it's very likely that I've talked about this sort of thing in the past, but I'm just going to repeat myself because it's very relevant here, because animals tend to have fur. So the first thing here, I tend to say that there's a lot of first things, but whatever, is that the silhouette is important. And I know I've talked about this before. Information that you put inside of a shape doesn't tend to get registered until fairly late in the game. Meaning your eye, when it looks at something, goes through many phases where it notices different details. And the first thing that it's going to look at is the actual silhouette. So if you think of your drawing as being solidly filled with black, Any detail that you put inside is ignored at this point. And that's the first thing that your eye sees. So any information, however, that breaks this kind of regular curve stands out a lot. And this is actually why when you see someone that you know at a distance, where you can't actually make out any of the internal detail, but you can tell that it's still that person that you know, the reason for this is because there's two things and they're related. It's their silhouette, which has a very distinct outline, and it's their motion, which influences the silhouette that you see, the way they move. And so any character designs, you'll often see that concept artists will do sheets and sheets of silhouette brainstorming. And this is because the silhouette is such a key part of a character design that if reduced to just that simple outline or filled in shape, they still need to be recognizable. And so coming back to fur, it's an extremely useful tool that we can use because you can demonstrate very easily that a surface is bumpy like this, or jagged or spiky or whatever. Or, in our case, furry, or hairy for that matter. And all of this information is seen by the eye very quickly, and because it makes that first impression, it's a very strong impression. Now, one thing that you absolutely need to avoid is just attacking it with these stupid little individual lines that I tend to see people doing. That is, there's several things wrong with it. One of them being that it creates a bunch of tangents to your shape. And a tangent is when a line is 90 degrees to another line. And tangents tend to make people very uncomfortable and stressed out. So you want to avoid that kind of effect. So the solution to that would be to actually curve them. Now this still looks dumb because you have a solid broad shape, but these are still just lines. And while you may think of, individual strands of fur poking out from the form as being individual lines, they shouldn't be. It should actually be clumps and tufts of fur that are coming out, which are not lines, they are shapes. Like this. And you can have the odd, little line or strand coming out, but that is not the bulk of your texture. Actually, this kind of looks bad because it's just sticking out alone like that. Now, another thing that I see people doing when they attempt to do this is that they don't have the patience to really take the time and craft and design each one of these little tufts. So they'll kind of just go like this and hope for the best. Don't do that. All of our drawing exercises are about being very intentional with every single thing we put down on the page. If you just kind of zigzag and scribble or whatever along the edge, not only is that going back to our annoying randomness bit, but it's just sloppy. So don't do it. There's no reason to. Have the patience to actually carefully design each and every little mark that you put in. If it's intentional, if what you are trying to do is conveyed to your viewer, then it will look good. If you don't even know what you're trying to accomplish, then there's no way in hell that's going to happen. Now, there are situations where you might want to include a little bit of fur texture on the inside of a form, but it's something you want to use very sparingly. If you try and push your fur textures too hard, things will go bad very quickly. So usually when dealing with texture inside of a form, I usually tackle it as being the transition between dark and light. And the whole tuft to fur thing still applies here. I mean, I did rush in with a bit of hatching there, which probably wasn't the most appropriate. Now, the thing is that I don't use that. When something is furry and I can avoid it, I don't necessarily like using them as transition areas. Instead, whenever I've got like a sort of, this is probably a bad example. Whenever I've got a ridge, like between two muscles, often, like, animals tend to be very muscular, like tigers and bears and things like that. They've got a load of muscle on them, but oftentimes it's very obscured by all the fur on them, but you can still catch little glimpses of where, two muscle groups overlap. Oh, that's getting hairy. So an area like this, where you get this sort of dip between muscles, that's usually where you actually see the lines that kind of show you that something is muscular. It's because one muscle is overlapping another. Now, if you want to show that in fur, you can't just draw the usual solid lines. Instead, you kind of have to use some very gentle hatching, maybe with slightly longer, more flowing lines. So that instead of where you would have had a straight line, or a smooth line, or unbroken line, whatever, you would have this sort of hatching texture, and you might have a little bit coming off of it. But it's generally a very light touch. You don't want to go too heavy with these things because they start to get way too cumbersome and distracting. That's why this approach with your silhouette is the most important, because it allows you to be it allows something to make an impact without being super distracting. It's really keying into your viewer's subconscious, because they're not fully aware, there aren't that many marks involved. All of this is empty. But they still understand that this surface is hairy, it's furry, it's not smooth. And you can use that with any texture, bumpy textures, jagged textures, like I showed you before. And you should use your silhouettes as much as possible, as they are very effective. Yeah. Now, I think that's the last point I wanted to make. So the last thing that I'll do is these two little demonstrations I have of how you can break down specific reference images into different kinds of forms and construction. Basically, how to apply construction to these subjects. So the first thing is going to be this horse head. As I mentioned before, I wanted to talk specifically about how to use construction when making heads so that people don't end up with random, floaty, ungrounded details. If you ever draw something that feels like it's floating, that it doesn't actually have anything informing you as to where that detail should go, like just an eye sitting on a form randomly with no socket to fit into, you're doing it wrong. Everything needs to be grounded and connected to something else. Nothing exists in a vacuum, and you'll never have a sort of, let's back up. You'll never have, why can't I draw ellipses? something like that. It's always going to be objects wrapping around each other, connecting with each other, and so on. So you can have an eyeball, you can have an eyelid wrapping around that eyeball, and coming up to the brow. And then you've got the bridge of the nose coming down and all that garbage. So everything always has to be connected and grounded in something else. So with this horse head, this is basically what I was talking about before, where you've got your cranium. I've got the neck coming down here, which is kind of besides the point. And then you've got this box that is curving around the cranium as where it connects to it, and then the box comes down. And you can see that there's a little flaring of the box down here. This isn't necessarily something I'd include right off the bat. I'd build a much larger box. Like that or something. And then I'd break it down, and you'll see me doing that in a second. So start off with your cranium, and what I always like to do, although in my drawings you tend to see it being quite sloppy, because when I draw ellipses on my Cintiq, they tend to come out like crap. But always be aware of the center lines of your balls. Whatever. And this new driver I installed is really making my lines wobble. Or maybe it's just my hand, because I've been on vacation and I've gotten rusty. So I've got the neck coming down. I haven't really put too much focus into that because it's not that important right now. And here's our box. So you'll notice that the box is coming down the full length all the way down to the end of the snout. And so I will build upon the end part of it. But for now, I'm just leaving it coming straight down so that we have a basic scaffolding on which to build the further information. And this is where I'm doing that. So instead of actually instead of flaring it out like this, I decided that looking at this horse head, it actually kind of narrows in. And so I kind of cut into the box instead of building on top of it. And as I mentioned before, I've got these eye sockets, which are super important, and you can actually use them to kind of show how this is a sort of contour line, but it's more geometric because it's heads tend to be quite planar, even though they don't always look that way. Being aware of how these lines come down and connect to everything can be very useful when it comes to construction. And honestly, I'm just kind of making these lines up. It's not like they're actually situated on the head, but they really help me understand how my forms fit together. And then you just add more details. You can fit your eyes into the socket, and always be aware of how they connect. And as usual, these are all additional construction lines that we're drawing right now, and you'll be drawing them for a long time as you get used to understanding how form all fits together. Now, ideally, eventually, the lines that you're drawing, that you're actually putting down, will start to leak into your subconscious, and you'll be able to visualize them instead of drawing them quite as much as you do right now. But don't worry about the fact that these drawings aren't clean and neat and tidy. Every line that we put down is deliberate and has a certain purpose to it, but you can't, like right now, you're just not ready to go without those lines. Think of it as training wheels. I'm already hitting the 40-minute mark. Try to keep these videos at 40 minutes, but this is the last little demo that I've got, and it's a more complete drawing of this tiger. And so here's the initial forms that we talk about. There's the rib cage, which, as I mentioned, I kind of approximated to fit within the tiger itself. It's not just a sphere. The angle is important, and I'm trying to keep an eye on how all of that fits together. Same with the pelvis, although I probably could have made the pelvis a little bit more narrow. But, you know, these steps, because we're using them to build a more complete sausage, we can kind of let those things go a little bit. Just make sure that the sausage comes out right. That's the main thing, because the sausage, the torso, is what everything builds on top of. And then you've got these legs coming off the actual side of the torso, not from the bottom. And they're broken up into straight sections. Oops. And this section of the legs are all two-dimensional at this point because I'm just focusing on how they're laid out and their basic gesture, not so much on their form. So, cranium, ribcage, pelvis. Make the ribcage and the pelvis into a sausage. That's really annoying. Make sure that you nail that connection and kind of cut the front of the front of the rib cage to be flat so you can connect the neck to it. And as with that previous drawing, I've got a tail coming off of here, and it's just, I didn't actually draw the spine. You don't always have to, but it's probably a good idea if you're just starting out. And try and keep your widths nice and consistent. As I mentioned before, that's actually quite difficult, so don't worry too much if you mess it up. Mistakes are normal. So the next point is that, as you can see here, I have that little dip in the tiger, or his back, or the sausage actually, but it's actually got an extra lump here. And so I've gone here and added an additional form, and I did the same thing here where my sausage didn't quite get that sort of shoulder bump. Now I'm jumping into constructing the legs, so I need to know exactly where they're going to connect to the body, and it's not as clear here, but you know, if you look closely, you can see that there's a little pinch here, something like that maybe. And here, also be aware of this sort of pinch where because when you got fur, and especially these stripe patterns, you know, they exist because they help tigers camouflage in the woods. So it's all about breaking up their form and making them much harder to see. And so the actual underlying, it actually helps camouflage the underlying forms as well. It just makes a very, you know, regular pattern. Actually, it's kind of an irregular pattern, but anyways, it breaks up the shadows that you might see from their underlying forms. So it can be very tricky at times to make this out. So it will take practice to become accustomed to what kind of forms are lying under there. So you just need to try your best to identify them and make a hell of a lot of mistakes along the way. And here are my legs. They're just simple two-dimensional shapes. But of course, as always, I'm still aware of the fact that they're 3D, so I never want to be like ignore that completely. I never want to just be drawing, you know, basic crappy shapes like that. This one is actually kind of this one is actually kind of important, and I will highlight it in red. Now, basically the only thing I've done here is I've tucked in the belly a little bit just before it hits the back leg. And this is actually something you see very often in a lot of different four-legged animals. And the tiger's got it going on right here. Actually, it's more like here because this is more of a tuft of fur. And it's just little things like this that as you continue to practice and study these animals, you start to notice these things. So you may not catch it immediately, but over time you'll start to realize that there's these little common things, because all these animals, you know, they have common ancestors and they're constructed in very much a similar way. And that's actually probably a little hint as to where the rib cage ends. Although here you can tell that in my drawing it doesn't match up. But that's my mistake. So now I'm going to construct the head. So I've added an additional ball because my cranium kind of got lost and it was probably a little too small. But remember that I'm not outright just ignoring previous construction. I'm building that ball onto the existing nub of that neck. And here, I won't go too much in depth with this, but it's basically the same thing. You know, I've got my muzzle that wraps around the cranium ball, got my eye sockets to make sure that I can fit these, you know, I have somewhere to place the little eyeballs. And here I'm just really refining my forms. You can see that tigers have this sort of shape like that. And it's more fur than anything else, I think. I mean, I'm not entirely sure, but whatever. And here I'm just kind of reinforcing some line weights, and it's gotten really cluttered and really messy already, and honestly, I probably should have drawn it with a much thinner brush tip size. But what's done is done. And so I was a bit on the fence about whether or not I would actually add these stripes, just because there's already such a mess there already, and texture, of course, not that important. We're focusing on the underlying form construction, which pretty much stops here, but I figured it would be good to just finish it up all the way. And so because I'm working in Photoshop and I've been doing this specifically for a step-by-step demo that I'll put, actually, I mean, this was the step-by-step demo, I can just hide some of these layers and show you what the cleaner version of it would look like, and it's something like that. And so even though the underlying contour lines, a lot of them are gone, the impact that they had in my understanding of how these forms are all laid out is still somewhat apparent there in my forms. And so that's honestly pretty much all I've got for you. I've also done 3 more demos that I'll be adding to the lesson page today. So as you can see here, I have these 3 demos, but they're old and I mean, they do follow the constructional method, but it's a much more, you know, watered down, more 2D, less 3D form kind of thing, which was the way that I had initially learned it, but I personally find the stress on 3D forms from the get-go. Like here, you know, this isn't stressing very many 3D forms, but I do end up pushing it later on in the demo. Now I found that for students, it's a lot better to do that right from the beginning and to immediately think of this is not a circle, this is a ball, or, you know, anything like that, and to be more aware of how things intersect. And yeah, some of these demos are not the strongest. And so I will be replacing them today. Or at least adding new ones. These will still be here, but follow the newer ones more than the old ones. And also, another thing to be aware of is that there's all these extra demos that I've done as parts of critiques, and these can be very helpful. I usually write a lot of notes on them. So like about fur and, you know, the whole tangents and scribbling, and this one kind of shows how you can apply the various ways of showing fur. Like you can use it as a transition between light and dark. You can put it along the silhouette. You can have little bits here and there on the inside. Yeah, these can be quite helpful. So that's pretty much it. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I hope it helps clarify some of the material in the lesson. Remember that you still, this is not, you know, a standalone thing. This is just an introduction to the lesson itself. And you can find that right here, drawabox.com/lesson/5, where you can find it.